Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Krishnaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swami Namine Namo Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharini Nirvishesha Shanavadi Paschatya Deshatarini Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Srivasadi Gauravata Vrinda Jaya Shri Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama.
Hare Krishna. So welcome back to the Memorial Festival for Srila Prabhupada. The reason we celebrate the Memorial Festival is because His Holiness Bhakti Charu Swami for many, many years on his appearance day, the 17th of September, would glorify Srila Prabhupada's arrival to America. In particular, he came to Boston Harbor in 1965, 17th of September. So every year, Gurudev would do this program, invite his god brothers and god sisters to speak, and he would speak and glorify Srila Prabhupada. Hence, we having the Guru Puja. Now, for the second half of the program, we have many different speakers from 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. for the next 2 hours. His Holiness Guru Prasad Swami, His Holiness Lokanath Maharaj, His Grace Shesha Prabhu, His Holiness Radhanath Swami, His Holiness Sachinanda Maharaj, and His Holiness Hridananda Das Goswami. So our next speaker is His Holiness Guru Prasad Swami, who studied nuclear physics and joined ISKCON shortly after, and got initiated by Srila Prabhupada in 1976 in Mayapur, took sannyas in 1982, and has been the GBC, or been involved in the GBC since 1987, predominantly in Latin American countries. And he has a very close relationship with Bhakti Charu Swami. So on behalf of Bhakti Charu Swami and his disciples, we'd like to welcome you, Maharaj, to this beautiful memorial festival, Srila Prabhupada. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to glorify Srila Bhakti Charu Swami Maharaj, my dear friend. My only lamentation was that I never got enough association, and that I was supposed to go just in a few weeks with him on pilgrimage in Mayapur. But anyway, Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Pristhaya Bhutale Shrimati Bhakti Vedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gaudavani Pacharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatadishatarine Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Pristhaya Bhutale Shrimati Bhakti Charu Swaminiti Namane. So I was very happy to have this opportunity on the 17th of September, Srila Prabhupada's arrival, because your Guru Maharaj, Srila Bhakti Charu Maharaj, was an emissary of Srila Prabhupada. I just wanted to mention, before I go into my particular subject matter of Srila Prabhupada, that in 1970, Srila Prabhupada had his Vyasa Puja ceremony for Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur. And on that occasion, Prabhupada sat on a very low seat, very, very low seat. Although devotees were used to seeing Srila Prabhupada on a very high seat, but he sat on a very low seat, and Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur's picture was on a very high seat. So this reminded me, I was reading this recently, and it reminded me of the one time when Srila Bhakti Charu Maharaj visited us in Mexico, and he came into my little office, and just 2 days before, there was a murti of Srila Prabhupada that had one temple, our farm temple, had been closed, and they some devotees had kept the murti, but they brought it and they put it in my office. And the Vyasa was only, or the seat that Prabhupada was on was only about 3 inches higher than my seat. And Bhakti Charu Maharaj, in his usual very humble manner, he looked at me with a chastising smile, and then looked at Prabhupada's Vyasa. And immediately I understood. And I called the devotees and had them bring in 10 cushions and put Prabhupada on a much higher platform. So this was a constant evidence that I saw again and again of his glorification. His life was a glorification of Srila Prabhupada. And this incident has inspired me to speak what I wanted to speak today, about Srila Prabhupada. And by his grace, I learned how there can never be enough reverence for Srila Prabhupada. And this is especially something that we have to inculcate, instill in our society in this generation, because if we don't, then Srila Prabhupada can be waysided, which would be the end of ISKCON. So, Srila Prabhupada was the emblem of humility. When the devotees had purchased the Los Angeles temple and they prepared Srila Prabhupada's room, of course, they did it very nicely. In Srila Prabhupada's first visit to Mexico, the devotees, as it's very common in Latin America, you do something at the last minute. Sometimes I say, don't do tomorrow what you could leave for the next day. That's the mentality. So they painted the floor, because it was a cement floor. They painted the floor, and then Srila Prabhupada came in, but the floor was still wet. It was oil paint, and oil paint takes a long time to dry. So the devotees had not gone into his room because they decorated everything, then they painted. And when one devotee walked into the room and stepped on the paint, it was just one step ahead of Srila Prabhupada. He immediately pulled off his dhoti and put it on the floor and spread it out. And he was just there in his kurta and spread it out so Srila Prabhupada could walk on the dhoti. And then another devotee took a chadar and put it on the floor so Srila Prabhupada could offer obeisances. And because at that time, his room, they had some deities in there. And Srila Prabhupada, of course, he understood what had happened. And he smiled and said, oh, this no problem. This is happening everywhere. I am used to the smell of fresh paint. Of course, it was a little too fresh. So when Prabhupada went into his room for the first time, and the devotees had painstakingly tried to discover what colors, what Srila Prabhupada liked, and they took from Srila Prabhupada's, he had spoken to devotees before, how the house, the Mullik house, had been decorated, and so they tried to do it as much as possible, just to make Srila Prabhupada feel with blue walls and white floor, although he had a red marble floor in the Mullik house. And Prabhupada was very pleased. But they had put a brand new rug. So Srila Prabhupada said, I will teach you the India system. India system is that you put a sheet over the rug, and only on special occasions do you take it off. Prabhupada said, otherwise the rug will be, will become used up and will not be very nice. And of course, that also reminded me how Srila Prabhupada would take one piece of paper and he would note down things, and then he would note sideways, and he would, even though Prabhupada had at his disposition hundreds of thousands of dollars, he would so carefully meditate on how everything belonged to Krishna, and it should be used very carefully. As Srila Prabhupada said many times, don't spend one farthing. Everything for Krishna, not one farthing for oneself. So Srila Prabhupada, so devotees just kind of put a sheet over it, and Prabhupada said, no, the sheet must not have any wrinkles. And so two devotees got on their knees, and Prabhupada himself got down on his knees and started smoothing out the sheet and tucking it under the rug, said, this is how you do it. And Prabhupada said, now you have learned something from India. No, this is how things should be done. So Srila Prabhupada was very, very happy. And he instructed the devotees. The next day he went to the temple. He had his Vyasa at that time was in the back. And he instructed the devotees how to put how to decorate the altar, how to put the symbols of Vishnu. And then he told the devotees, always keep this middle section, always keep it clear so that I can see the deities. So Prabhupada was instructing them, who is the spiritual master? What is the position of the spiritual master? But the devotees, they were very new. And then there were a series of events that happened. Of course, one on the first few days of Prabhupada giving classes, he was so happy to see this wonderful temple that he began his Bhagavatam class and he went into ecstasy, and he just was tears streaming from his eyes, his body shivering, and devotees had never seen this before. And so they just chanted Hare Krishna, and then Prabhupada came out of his ecstasy, said, "Is everyone all right?" And then devotees were just Jai Prabhupada. Then he began to give his lecture. And this also happened in Caracas, Venezuela, when Prabhupada was visiting. He sang Paramakaruna. And as he sang it, about halfway through the song, tears were streaming from his eyes. And he went into ecstasy for like 15 minutes. And devotees didn't know what to do. And so one devotee said, "We should chant." And they chanted. And then Prabhupada came out of his ecstasy, spoke just for like 2 minutes. And he said, "They are so merciful." And then Prabhupada went to Miami, and they had just installed Gaurnitai deities. And Prabhupada said, "These are our lordships, Shri Shri Gaurnitai. There is no need for Radha and Krishna. Gaurnitai is enough." And Prabhupada said, "Of course, Radha and Krishna, they can come, but one must be ready. But we must always worship Gaurnitai." And then he went to Atlanta. The same deities from the same mold, big brass deities. And Prabhupada again went into ecstasy because this was a Sankirtan festival. And Prabhupada, of course, was very, very keen on establishing Sankirtan. And seeing so many devotees distributing his books, he again went into ecstasy. And after he came out, he just spoke about the mercy of Gaurnitai, Paramakaruna. So anyway, going back to Los Angeles. So then after a few days, some things started happening. One morning, Srila Prabhupada took the Charnamrita, and they gave him his usual 3 drops, and he put it in his mouth, and he made a very unhappy face. And he said, "Who has put salt in the Charnamrita?" And one girl stood up and kind of giggling and laughing and said, and Prabhupada said, "Why did you do this?" And she said, "I don't know," laughing. And Prabhupada said, as he said many times, like one time, Shrutakirti Prabhu was fanning him, and there was a fly buzzing around Prabhupada's head. And Prabhupada said, "The purpose of the chamara is so the fly does not come." And then Prabhupada turned to Tamal Krishna Maharaj and said, "Please get someone with some intelligence." So he said the same thing about this girl, that please get someone with some intelligence. How can this happen? And then he opened the Bhagavatam, which had just come out from the Boston press. And he looked at the front page and it said, A.C. Bhaktivedanta. And Prabhupada became very disturbed. And he said, why am I being reduced? No, there was no His Divine Grace, there was no Prabhupada. And then Prabhupada, shortly thereafter, he said, every temple, every letterhead, everything should have ISKCON founder Acharya A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami, His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Because Prabhupada did this so that his position as the founder Acharya would be managed. And then Prabhupada opened the Bhagavatam and it cracked and the pages started falling out. So Prabhupada could see that his disciples, although very sincere, were very neophyte and they didn't understand. And then during a Srimad Bhagavatam class, Srila Prabhupada spoke to one of his leading lady disciples, Nandarani Devi Dasi, and he said, so are you chanting 16 rounds? And she said, I'm trying, Prabhupada. So Prabhupada could understand, my disciples are not reading my books, my disciples are not chanting. So Prabhupada perceived that there was a danger. And then that danger became greater and greater. In India, he got a letter from his disciples who had just been installed in India, saying that his god brothers were complaining, that they're calling him Prabhupada, and they were creating doubts in the minds of his disciples. And then all these things started affecting his writing, because Prabhupada would, he would have many books, and he would do his translating, he would refer to his previous books. He needed so much concentration that it was disturbing him. And he spoke to the devotees. And then he got a letter from Guru Das saying that Mr. Parikh had been giving class from his Vyasa. And he said, why are you allowing? Because he was asking Prabhupada, sometimes he's speaking about Aurobindo, and sometimes he's speaking about someone else. And Prabhupada said, no one should sit on my Vyasa, and no one who is not a dedicated member should not be speaking. And so Prabhupada could see another symptom. And then he started seeing that the leaders and the new sannyasis were speaking that, Prabhupada, he's old and we should take over the management. So Prabhupada called Tamal Krishna Maharaj and said, get me out of here. He called some of his leaders and he established the GBC body. He said, he called his most trusted leaders and said, you have to run the society. I'm going to India. I have to go to India. And of course, he stopped on the way, he stopped in Japan. And in Japan, he got the most disturbing report that after the Janmashtami festival, that some of his sannyasis were saying that Srila Prabhupada left the United States because he was rejecting his disciples. And that from this point on, because they didn't realize that Prabhupada was God. And so Prabhupada was so disturbed. And then the next day, well, actually the same day, but they had the Vyasa Puja ceremony. This was the first Vyasa Puja ceremony. And so the devotees came up, they didn't know what to do. They were standing in front of Prabhupada. And Prabhupada said, where is the Pushpa Yatra, the Pushpa ceremony? And devotees, so the only thing they had heard of as Pushpa was Pushpana, which is Pushpa rice. So Tamal Krishna Maharaj told the devotees, go cook Pushpa rice. And they brought a big pot of Pushpa rice and put it down. Prabhupada's hungry, he wants Pushpa rice. And Prabhupada said, what is this concoction? And then they started reading some things, they didn't know what to do. And Prabhupada said, everybody sit down. Tomorrow we will do this again. And he instructed everybody how to do the Vyasa Puja. And Prabhupada had realized at that point that Mayavad philosophy had come in, his disciples didn't know what they were doing. And so he wrote many, many letters. You have to chant your rounds. You have to read my books. You have to understand all of these things. And so Prabhupada, for days and days, he wrote, and he got more letters. The devotees were confused after the New Vrindavan Vyasa Puja ceremony. And then he wrote a letter, and they thought that he had rejected him. So Prabhupada wrote a letter, my dear sons and daughters, and everybody was relieved. Prabhupada has not rejected us. And Prabhupada explained Mayavad philosophy, and this was a big mistake. And anyway, the point I wanted to make, because my time is almost up, is that Srila Bhakti Charu Maharaj dedicated his life to making sure, that's why I'm bringing up these particular points. He wanted to make sure that Srila Prabhupada's legacy would go on. Srila Prabhupada, on many occasions, at one point, he was even beginning to translate the 11th canto. But it was all interrupted by so many problems. And as we know, Srila Prabhupada wanted to finish the Bhagavatam. He wanted to translate other literatures, but he was so concerned that ISKCON would be solid, that there would be a GBC that would represent him, that this movement would go on, that he gave up his most cherished. This is what I always consider one of Srila Prabhupada's greatest characteristics. He gave up the most cherished activity of translating to make sure this movement would go on. And therefore, I always felt that Bhakti Charu Maharaj had this mood of making sure with his disciples, with the world and the GBC meetings every time, that this ISKCON movement would go on and Srila Prabhupada would be properly glorified. So this is the message that I wanted to give in glorification of Srila Bhakti Charu Maharaj and his wonderful effort to maintain and sustain ISKCON, which was Srila Prabhupada's very fervent desire. So I want to thank you very much for your kind attention. Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Srila Bhakti Charu Maharaj ki jai.
His Holiness Guru Prasad Swami Maharaj ki jai. Thank you, Maharaj, for giving us these beautiful stories of Srila Prabhupada and then summarizing it with Bhakti Charu Swami, keeping the integrity of ISKCON alive. Thank you so much. And now, thank you so much, Maharaj. And now we will go to our next guest speaker.